Hello, it's Pastor Brian here. I want to welcome Reverend Abby to our space today for Upside Down Church. I want to introduce her a little bit, and then I'll give her the chance to introduce herself. I know her from our shared work at Drew University. I just wrapped up my PhD there, but she's in the midst of wrapping up her PhD. And so we go back a while in our work at Drew. First, I want to talk a little bit about what Upside Down Church is for those that don't know. So Upside Down Church is a space for us to talk about, discuss, dialogue over challenging or difficult topics, something that is particularly relevant in the moment, and do so through the lens of justice and compassion. And so for this month, what we'll be doing is talking about climate change and environmentalism, because our conversation will be held on Earth Day. So if you're watching this for the Saturday, April 22nd conversation, it is Earth Day today. And so that is why we are talking about this topic. It just made sense for it to be today. But before we dig into our conversation, before Abby and I start chatting, I'd like you, Abby, to share a little bit about yourself, who you are, the work that you do, maybe briefly touch on how faith intersects with that work. Whatever you want to share to get us going today would be awesome. So thank you, Abby. You have the floor.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Mohaupt. I'm ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and I've been ordained for almost 10 years. And when I went through the ordination process in my tradition, and this is relevant, I promise, the denomination said that I probably wouldn't have, they didn't really understand how I, as a minister, would have anything relevant to do with the environment. And 10 years later, I have a full-time job doing that, but also people of faith all over the world are grappling with what it means to live in this particular time and place with climate change and the environment. And so I raise that simply to say that even in the last 10 years, the way that we as people of faith grapple with our ecological vocation has changed. So I'm based in Chicago. I'm from Northern Illinois originally. I've spent the last 10 years living in California and Texas and New Jersey. And now I'm back home in the watershed and the land of the peoples of the three fires, which are the indigenous peoples who have called this place home for millennia. And I work full-time as the director of education for Green Faith, for an international interfaith environmental nonprofit where we do bold action for climate justice, which just means that we dig into the faith traditions and resources and rituals that guide our faith and moral compasses, and use that to support ourselves as we call governments and institutions to be more just around climate and environmental issues. I'm also a mom to a kid named Juniper, who's about 2 years old, and I'm an artist and an avid runner. And all of those pieces are what I bring to this conversation. And as Brian said, I'm doing a PhD in religion, culture, and ecology at Drew. And I study how religious movements have impacted the world with our whole selves, with our hearts and minds and souls, and our money. So a different topic for a different day might be how our investments and money choices affect the environment and climate. So thanks for having me. It's good to be with you, Brian, in real life over Zoom, and then to be recorded with all the rest of you.
Yeah, welcome to the space. We're glad to have you to be a part of this conversation. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were saying that, you used the term, I think it was bold action for Green Faith, but also this notion of wrestling. And so to me, this notion of wrestling is more around the relationship of how we think, and then this bold action is what we do. And so I've been having conversations with folks around this topic and kind of thinking through the relationship between how we think and what we do. and how they're kind of always intertwined with each other.
Hmm.
But for you in your work, do you find one as either more important or more engaging? Um, is there one that you tend to kind of lean on more when you're working with folks?
Yeah, so I want to put a caveat on that by saying that we work with environmentalists and people of faith all over the world. So what's at stake for folks, or the risk that people have from doing this work is different in different parts of the
Hmm.
world. So for example, my colleagues in East Africa and Tanzania and Uganda, and Nigeria all face the potential of being killed for their work.
Mm.
Um, or being imprisoned for longer than we might assume in the United States. Maybe you've seen people getting arrested in the US at a pipeline um, or some kind of other environmental protest. And usually people in the US can assume that they're going to be released with maybe a small fine. And that's not true in other places of the world. Um, and I raise that to say that I actually think the wrestling with our, and I'll just speak about Christianity here, though Green Faith is interfaith, the wrestling with our scriptures and our theological resources and the songs and prayers that undergird our spirituality. It's necessary for us as we commit to bold action, trying to respond to climate injustice and climate change, because it's hard work that carries high risk for a lot of us in the work. And the wrestling with the theological and spiritual resources and questions help keep us resilient in the larger action, the larger struggle, um, and kind of give greater purpose to the struggle. And so it can be really easy to say, okay, I'm going to think about this scriptural text, and then I'm going to take bold action, or I'm going to pray a prayer or do a guided walking meditation and then go take action. And what we do at Green Faith actually is to say all of these actions start with, at the action themselves, with prayer and song and deepening, and that the people who are joining in the actions are grounded in spirituality. So we always do spiritual groundings at the beginning of all of our trainings, and it's great. It's been helpful to think about how we're able to boldly respond to the environmental and climate crisis of our time because we're grappling and wrestling with the spiritual and theological texts of our faith.
I mean, what you were describing to me, what it got me thinking about is this idea of speaking truth to power.
Mm-hmm.
And that depending on where you're located, your social location, speaking truth to power is going to look like different things, right? Because of the danger involved in that. And so could you speak a little bit about what it might mean to speak truth to power, particularly in the United States, and then what it might look like somewhere else, where there's a different dynamic, a different danger.
Yeah. I also think it has to do, there's a difference between geography, but also religious tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you asked that question, and I immediately thought about how the moment about a year and a half ago, in October, when Indigenous leaders invited faith leaders from around the world, but mostly the United States, to come to DC, to ask Biden to have a more comprehensive climate justice response to some of the pipelines. And there was a particular day when the Indigenous leaders asked visible people of faith, mostly faith leaders, to risk arrest in front of the White House. and to basically take over the space and trespass on the space in front of the White House where lots of people protest, right? And to visibly be people of faith in that demand that Biden shut down pipelines and stop funding the fossil fuel industry. And that day came after Indigenous folks had done an action, I think the day before. So visibly Indigenous folks did an action, and then the next day, other people of faith and spirit did an action. And I showed up in my collar as a Christian faith leader, and was there with several of my colleagues and friends in the struggle, including Arthur Waskow, who's a Jewish rabbi and teacher and philosopher. And maybe, Brian, you've read some of his stuff in our coursework, right? But so Arthur's there, and he's like 90, and it was his 89th birthday. So we all sang happy birthday to him while we were waiting to be told that we were trespassing. And there were some of us who were like singing, but then the other rabbis had been carrying musical instruments, and so they started singing these protest songs that were very Jewish, and they just kept leading us and singing and singing and singing and singing and singing and singing, right? Like the whole idea of cantering, right, is so embedded in Jewish religious experience.
Yeah.
And so they had just said, okay, we're going to like cantor right here, which is not something that is like deeply embedded in my Presbyterian religious experience, right? Like, and it was so beautiful that that was a very Jewish expression of resistance.
Yeah.
And then we like got arrested and got released, but we were seeing in kind of the chat that the charges that we were being given were a lot different than the Indigenous folks who were charged the day before. And so even in the United States, there's a different risk to people when they're creating bold action. And so when I think about who I am as a white Christian responding to climate justice, it becomes more and more clear and necessary for me to live out my faith, and particularly the call to love God and creation and each other, by kind of leaning into that privilege to saying, okay, if it's less risky for me to do X, Y, and Z than the same person doing X, Y, and than a different person doing X, Y, and Z, I need to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
To try to take some of the risk on. So then I think about my colleagues in Africa, and I'm going to speak very broadly about this to protect their security. But I hope that you all won't hear my broadness as anything other than trying to protect their security. These are real people and real instances. But there's a pipeline being built through East Africa right now that is being funded by a French oil and gas company called Total. And the pipeline has been approved by the national governments on the east side of the African continent as a way to bring in more economic resources. But grassroots communities have rejected it because they know that the pipelines are going to spill. It's inevitable.
Inevitably, yeah, it happens.
They are going to break because nothing is perfect, right? Nothing is indestructible. And so these grassroots communities have risen up to protest and have leaned into their faith and said, as Christians, as Muslims, as Hindus, we're saying, like, we do not want these pipelines in our communities. And they're being beaten and arrested and disappeared for small amounts of time and then released. And it's horrifying. And still, they keep coming. They keep rising up, like, just there with so much courage, and like willing to lead with joy, right? And faith, and saying I even as I'm saying this, I can hear some of my colleagues talk about how, as people of faith called by God to love the earth and other people, we have to stop pipelines. Otherwise, we're unfaithful to that call. We have to stop drilling. We have to boldly stop climate change if we're going to be faithful Christians, because we know that climate change hurts the most vulnerable people of the world before it hurts people with privilege and power. Yeah. So that's kind of the two different scenarios that I see, both and when we risk any kind of public action around grounded in our faith, it can be scary, but it also allows us to live into our faith more boldly.
It makes me think of yesterday being Easter, this idea of Jesus rising so that we can rise. But thinking about it in a different way is that this idea that Jesus will not be held down by the empire, will not be held down by despair, but will rise up. And it's an example of, for us to say, we will do the same. That a way of living out our faith is to be Easter people, is to be folks who show up and say, we will overcome that which is trying to beat us down. And I feel like that's a prime example of that, is they're being Easter people.
Yeah, that's right. And being willing to kind of say, as you said, that Jesus was trying to be contained by the empire, and there's still imperial forces, if I can say that.
Yes.
Without being too dorky with my Star Wars references. But there's still imperial forces that are saying, like, we just want more money, and we want more land, and we want more development, and we don't really care, like, how many worlds we destroy or how many people we destroy. Like, we got to put down pipelines, instead of saying maybe there's another way. Especially when we've just, like, for me, it's just been a really interesting Lent and Holy Week and then Easter, when the UN just released its most recent report on climate change that said that things are just getting worse. Like, what a time to get that report in the middle of Easter, or the middle of Lent, and say,
yeah,
like, okay, and then to, like, think about it on Good Friday when the empire wins. To think, okay, Jesus is dead and the earth is dying. This sucks. And then if we really believe in the reality of the resurrection, this, like, impossible life after death that God is inviting us into, what does that mean for us in response to climate change and environmental injustices? I don't think that means that God's going to, like, swoop in and save us.
I was going to say, we're going into a narrative that could be slightly dangerous. Yeah.
But I think, as you said, if Jesus rises and invites us to rise with him, right? That Jesus is pushing back on the forces of death, and it's our job to push back against those two.
Yeah, I mean, there's the danger of this idea of, and people will read particular parts of the Bible kind of through this lens of, it doesn't matter what we do because everything's going to be destroyed, and there's going to be this new Jerusalem, this new earth that comes. But in reality, it's more so a time and again you see Jesus calling us into doing something, to come alongside and do the work with, not just say, oh, God will take care of it. And it doesn't
Did
make
you
sense for us
say,
to
yeah. Did you say hauling or calling
calling
with a C?
us with a C. Yeah, calling us
Because
into.
sometimes I wonder if hauling might be a different, like a better way to be like, yeah, come on,
You better
people,
do this. Yeah,
come
you better do
on,
this.
right? Like,
Yeah.
come do this work. I've called you and
There's
now
gonna
I'm
be a
gonna
lot of
haul
people that,
you.
yeah, there's gonna be a lot of people that need to be hauled. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Like, and
that's funny.
yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about that actually. Um, yeah, it's really hard and it's really scary. And man, I wish that God would just like come down and be like, come down from wherever God is to say, okay, I'm gonna wave my magic wand. But that's not how we see God working anywhere else, right?
So
And
that's not God's justice. God's
right,
justice isn't just, I'm gonna make you do the thing. It
right,
looks different. So can you
right.
speak a little bit to how this is a matter of justice?
Yeah. So um we know that climate change affects people who have least contributed to climate change, first and worst. So communities that like those communities that experience climate change already are communities that are poor, are people of color, are in countries that have they're not yet developed to the kind of standard of economic development that we often think is the most developed. And so those countries and communities are already experiencing climate change, and they haven't experienced the benefits of the
Right.
fossil fuel
Right.
industry. Um, and um, they're not getting compensation for the destruction that they're experiencing. And so all of that is unjust. And we also talk about climate debt that industrialized countries owe underdeveloped communities and countries reparations and funds for the debt that those countries have incurred because of climate change. And kind of that's one aspect of climate injustice, that basically people they're not getting the rewards of fossil fuels. They're only getting the harm of the effects of burning fossil fuels. And then there are industrialized countries that have had all of the perks and very few of the pain and suffering. And we're seeing
Yeah.
that's changing a little bit, but like when I think about increased tornadoes in northern Illinois, for example, we also have an infrastructure to respond to that suffering.
Right. Right. So it's this idea so you use the term poor. I usually translate it when I think about it as under-resourced. And
Yep.
so then what happens is it's more tangible in that you can't respond to things that are happening if you don't have the resources to do so. And because you're an under-resourced community, you can't respond to whatever climate disaster is occurring right in
Yes.
front of you.
Yes. And you're not
Whereas,
under resourced because you're lazy or
right,
because you
or
don't
those
care about
narratives,
your
yeah,
people, right? Like you don't care
yeah,
about your community. You either have different community values that value sustainability, or you've been marginalized by capitalism and colonization and
your
white
resources have been
supremacy. Yeah,
your resources have been stripped from you by
that's
other
right.
communities that then
That's right.
have those resources to respond to climate change, but
Yes.
also already have the resources. They have.
Yes, that's right.
This is why they are who they are.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And if we're clear that the Bible tells us, like Jesus says over and over again, you're supposed to take care of the widow and the orphan, people who have been under-resourced. It's not a hard translation to then say, who are those people in our community now?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
the people in communities who've been under-resourced in regard to climate change. And so if we're going to work for justice, God's beloved community, God's compassion, like that's a clear indication of current modern day orphans and widows. And it's also really clear that they're not completely vulnerable, can't help themselves. Like if I've learned anything from my colleagues in East Africa, they have more grit, more courage, more know-how
Yeah.
than I do, right? And
Yeah.
are more willing to fight the fight that needs to happen.
It's not to or for, but it's with.
That's
It's
right.
doing the work with.
Alongside of and being changed by each other. Yeah.
While also kind of recognizing that because of the way in which things have occurred in the past, because of the way in which folks have extrapolated resources, that to respond to that is also a matter of compassion, and to realize you are in a situation that I have particular privileges, and it is my responsibility to work in a state of compassion, to say, okay, let's try to figure this out. Yeah. So it's you can't necessarily say justice and compassion are two separate things. That in this situation, they're so kind of intertwined and intermingled that they go together. To do justice is also to show compassion.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
I'm going to leave this conversation thinking about how privilege functions, and that privilege can also be used as a resource. And that is too often forgotten, that folks will rail against privilege, but to say, okay, no, I'm going to use the privilege that I have to do good, and to use that as something that can transform and to build a kingdom.
Yeah. And especially if we know that our privilege will protect us if we do bolder things. And so how do we take on the boldest things? So I wonder what the communities you're a part of would think about. Oh, what's the boldest possible thing we could do to respond to climate change? If we're,
I think that's where we'll start. I think
Great.
we can end this conversation here, and I think that's where we'll potentially start our conversation on the 22nd.
Amazing.
So Abby, thank you for coming into this this Zoom space to talk about this, to be colleagues in this work, but also to bring a voice for the communities that I work with, to help us kind of wrestle, like you had said, to wrestle and to think about what does bold action look like. So I appreciate you, and I thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for asking me, and thanks for this ministry.
All right, awesome.